Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law. I hope everyone is having a great day as always. And we are here with something different, not so much a legal review, but a convention review today. We are going to be discussing the recent CrimeCon convention that was held in Austin. This is the fifth year that the people who have held the convention have done so in different cities every time, is my understanding. My understanding is next time it will be in Las Vegas, for those of you who want to plan ahead. And it is devoted to all things true crime, which is a genre of shows, podcasts, movies, books related to discussion of crimes, particularly murders, and particularly serial murders and serial murderers. And it goes into a lot of detail regarding that in terms of forensic science, psychology, investigation technology, investigation methodology, interview techniques for the police, the criminal justice system, and also at this particular convention, there was some focus on wrongful convictions as well. We've discussed some of those cases before. We've discussed the case with the young child who gave the confession regarding Mercy Dawsey, I believe is his name. We've covered before a couple times on his appeal that was unsuccessful. So a couple cases like that with people with wrongful convictions, people talking of, and things like that. And of course, it's a lot of experts in the field and also celebrities. So Dr. Phil McGraw was there. Nancy Grace was there. What's his name? Chris Hansen. Why don't you have a seat over there? Chris Hansen. He was there. I only saw Phil McGraw. I wasn't really interested in what Nancy Grace or what Chris Hansen had to say personally. But they were there. So you had these people from media. You have police officers, forensic scientists. There was a guy who's running a private forensic company who's apparently, according to him, doing work better than currently being done by the FBI, or it's more expansive than work being done by the FBI. The degree to which that's true or not, I couldn't really say because it was less technical than I would want the discussion to be. But that's kind of the things that were being talked about by various people, various experts, all that stuff for that. So there was a lot of podcasters there with their booths. Yeah, I spoke to quite a lot of the podcasters there. It was interesting. Now, I'm told that this convention normally has, or at least last time it was held, which was 2 years ago, because obviously last year there was COVID. The last time it was held, there were 6,000 people there. And they said there were 1,500 people there, which seems like a reasonable estimate for the number of people that were there. I asked the people organizing it. They said 1,500. That seems like a reasonable number. And so apparently it was somewhat lower attended due to the coronavirus stuff, but there were still 1,500 people there. If I had to make a guess in terms of the demographics of the audience, I'd say it's about 80% female, if not a little bit higher than that. It's relatively young, all things considered. Probably the oldest people there are their 40s and 50s. And it's very interesting being in that room with those kind of demographics and that kind of interest. My overall takeaway of the whole thing was that I felt like a foreigner in a foreign land. And what I mean by that is there are things about culture that you probably don't know because it's like being in water. It's like a fish being in water. You don't notice the water because it surrounds you the whole time, right? So there's just a way that people act. There's a way that people behave. There's a way that people conduct themselves, a way that people talk, a way that people walk, a way that people hold themselves. There's there's all these things, and they accumulate in a way in any given society or any given culture that is noticeable if you're not from there. And they can be very, very subtle. It can be something like from one town to another. It can be one country to another, one state to another, right? So these changes don't necessarily need to be huge. You know, if you're coming from one country and going into a country that's very, very different, obviously these differences are going to be much more palpable. If you're going into your neighboring state or neighboring city, the differences may be less palpable, but they're going to be there. You know, different word choices, different ways people conduct themselves. You know, just different signs that something is different. And that's how I felt the entire weekend. I felt like a foreigner in a foreign land with in this room with 85% women, and listening to their reactions and listening to the way that they were, you know, conducting themselves, and just subtle things. And you're like, you know, something is different here. Something is different here. It was very interesting for me to behold. It was very interesting for me in particular because I felt, I don't know if felt is exactly the right word, but the room as a whole was acting emotionally, and I was acting analytically. And it was very interesting to observe people's emotional reactions to things, and also see inconsistencies in those reactions that they may not themselves not have noticed. Because then again, it's like the fish in the water. If you're in the water, you may not notice it, you know, because it's just normal to you. But if you're outside it, you might be able to see something that they can't see because they're just used to it, right? So it gives you powers of observations to notice things that are noticeable, and it also gives you things like, okay, there's some things here that are not quite squaring up, because you can notice these little changes in behavior, right? So it's really, really interesting, all the things considered. And I'll give you sort of the one biggest takeaway that made that readily apparent to me from the whole week, in terms of how I act or how I think, in terms of how everyone else collectively in the audience thinks, right? So I went to this one panel discussion, and there were, I don't know how many people were in that particular room that day. Maybe 300 people were in that room, maybe a little bit less, because there were, you know, different things happening different times, and so not everyone was in the same room at the same time, right? And this was going to be a ride along, which is not like being in a cop car, so I'm not sure the vernacular was proper. But the idea was, we're going to bring you along on a case like you are involved in the case, and we're going to have people who are involved in the case professionally there as sort of the moderators or leaders. So this particular situation dealt with a murder and potential serial murders coming out of Atlanta, Fulton County, and the Fulton County assistant district attorney was there. Apparently they have a district attorney for cold cases, as I understand it, and she was there. I think some of the police officers who involved were there's no one arrested yet, right? So it's a little bit early for the district attorney to get involved, but then again, she's a district attorney for cold cases, so, you know, whatever. But, you know, there's the police officers there, there's other professionals like that there, right? And the first woman gets up and speaks. And what she says to the audience is, I'm going to treat this like it's a police roll call. I'm going to just give you the facts, just give you the information that you need, like it's a police roll call, you know, just the facts, so we can all get started. And she says, does everyone understand that? The entire audience says, yes, we understand. All right. So the very next thing she does is she says, okay, here's the victim. She puts a picture of this young black woman on screen, like a yearbook shot or something like that, right? And the entire audience goes, "Aww." And what I'm thinking to myself is, okay, well, we're done. We're done. We literally couldn't make it 1 second. We literally couldn't make it 1 second. This is going to be like a police roll call. We're going to give you the facts. Right? Everyone understand that? Picture. Aww. Now, I've never been at a police roll call, but I'm going to guess, aww, is not the reaction of the typical police roll call. Because not for at least the reasons that they've, you know, seen a lot of stuff and stuff, so they're just interested in the facts so they can do their jobs. So I've never been in a police roll call, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a flyer. I'm going to take a flyer. And that, is not the reaction when they put the picture of the victim up at a typical police roll call. Just going to take a guess. So I'm like, okay, we're 1 second into this thing and we're already acting with emotion. And that was the entire weekend, pretty much. It was just emotion upon emotion upon emotion. It was compassion. It was compassion distilled. In the same way that being on Twitter is like swimming in anger, in the same way that being on Twitter is swimming in anger, being at CrimeCon is swimming in compassion. That was my takeaway. It's so much compassion. So much compassion. And all the reactions are emotional and compassionate. Which is an interesting thing to say, which is an interesting thing to observe, because compassion is not one of my go-to emotional states. It's not like it is foreign to me completely. It's not that I don't have a compassion ability, but compassion is not my go-to, right? In terms of emotional reactions, in terms of psychological reactions, compassion, as may surprise literally no one, is not necessarily the first thing that's going to come to my particular mind. But it was the first thing that was coming to the audience's collective mind, let me assure you. And it was very, very palpably obvious at every time. And I found it very interesting just watching people's reactions because their compassion was for victims. But who was a victim in any given situation isn't necessarily consistent. And this is one of the things that I observed is that from the dissidents, there's an emotional dissonance. It's not a cognitive dissonance because I seriously doubt that the audience collectively was looking at things cognitively, which is fine because they're looking at things emotionally, right? So they're using emotional parts of their brain rather than cognitive parts of their brain. But there's like emotional dissonance. So let me give you an example. Like I went to a lot of these things, and you see in one of the panels, they're talking about the serial killers. They're talking about these, people who are either unknown, cold cases, or known. And you hear the collective energy of the audience. The collective energy of the audience might be best summarized as, why do we even need trials? Why do we even need trials? Why do we need jails? Let's just put them under the jail. Let's just throw them away the key. Who cares about due process? Who cares about it? Look at how long these investigations are taking. Look how long the people are going without justice. We demand justice. We want it right now, right? The collective emotion is compassion. That's the primary emotion, is compassion. And because it's to a crime victim, the secondary or the derived emotion might be thought of as vengeance or desire for reciprocal balancing, right? It's a desire for justice, right? So that's the manifestation. But then you go to a different talk at a different time, and they're talking about false convictions, like the Dawsey case, which we've covered on the channel. The young kid who was mentally impaired, who the police probably fed him his confession, and it's on tape, and we covered the Court of Appeals case. It was the How to Make a Murderer case, right? His attorney, by the way, was there. She gave a talk. I listened to her. It was kind of interesting. It was compassion driven, which I guess she knows her audience, so there's that. So whether she's like that in, real life or not, she knows how to talk to her audience, so she's got that going on. But, the collective energy of the audience when they're in the Dawsey talk is, we need to get rid of the rule of finality. Why can't these people challenge the system? Why can't they get out? Surely we need to, make sure these people, why is it so hard to undo these convictions? Don't we need to make it earlier, easier, blah, 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 right? There's absolutely no awareness that I could see by anybody about tension between these goals, right? I couldn't perceive any collective awareness at all that there's tension between let's go get the bad guy, balls to the walls, vengeance, protect the innocent, put him under the jail, righteous fury. And on the other hand, oh, wait a second, maybe sometimes wrongful convictions though, right? And I wouldn't be upset. I wouldn't be upset if there was awareness of the disparity, right? Because these both might be very laudable goals, right? And I wouldn't be upset, or I wouldn't be noting it if they were saying, well, these are both laudable goals. And there was any kind of intellectual discussion really of any variety, because I didn't really think there was a lot of intellectual discussion really of any variety, in my humble opinion. But intellectual discussion of, hey, we have some competing goals here. How do we resolve these competing goals, right? I heard people say things like, the system is broken because the system yielded the system did blah, blah, blah. And I can't help thinking to myself, okay, how do you want to fix it? How do you want to fix it? And no one seems to be thinking that far ahead. It seems collectively, everyone is looking at the immediate situation. They're looking at the case in front of them. And they're saying, there is a problem here. I need to fix it here. And they're not thinking systematically. It doesn't feel systematic at all. Especially when you're talking about the system. It's like, oh, the system is broken. Okay, how do you want to fix it? Presumably, if you want to fix the system, we need to fix it systematically. Because that's what systems do. They do things systematically, right? So, okay, you have a case that shows you there's a problem. Great. How do you propose to resolve the system in a way that will fix this without breaking everything else? And there doesn't seem to be any awareness of all that at all, which is very interesting. I was talking to these college professors who also are police officers who helped to train is the wrong word, but they were teaching at one point the Pulse nightclub shooter, because the Pulse nightclub shooter, before he was the Pulse nightclub shooter, had, among other things, tried to apply to be a corrections officer or a law enforcement officer and all the rest of it. And one of the guys who was there, he's a police officer, and as I understand it, and I might be getting this slightly wrong, so forgive me if I'm getting it slightly wrong, but he's fairly high up in the chain in terms of admissions to who becomes a cadet in this police training milieu. All right? And he rejected the Pulse nightclub shooter. So apparently as I understand it, again, not 100% sure I'm getting this right, so forgive me. I definitely know he attended university classes at this college. But he was attending classes at some point, and he then also wanted to get into, so he was looking, basically it's like an associate degree for criminal justice, something like that. So you can get the degree, obviously, without becoming an officer. And also simultaneously with that, he's trying to become an officer, and he was rejected. So something about that is maybe slightly wrong, but you're getting the point, right? And it was interesting because he was giving a talk about how he and his colleagues got a lot of blame for the Pulse nightclub shooter. And I mean, I don't know that to be true, although I'm sure it is, that, he got some sort of blame. And they were going through like the steps that they took, and, that they saw these red flags, and they did these processes, and they didn't let him into the academy, and they called Homeland Security, they called the FBI, they notified the Florida system of this guy, to not hire him, so forth and so on, right? And I was thinking to myself, okay, but what else did they want you to do? right? And it's like, because if we're going to blame you, we're blaming you because you didn't do something or you should have done something. Like, what was that? I don't know. So I went to him later and I was talking to him, and because one of his colleague, his colleague, who was a woman, who was a police officer as well, of some variety, although didn't quite understand her role in this, in sort of the system, but she's also some sort of instructor, police officer as well. During her presentation, she gets up there and she says how, they made reports to, Homeland Security, they made reports to the FBI, and she does this, and the FBI goes, and everyone in the audience goes, because, you handed this to the FBI looks and goes, right? So now we want to cast aspersions on the FBI. All right. So I go up to these guys during the private Q&A. And I'm like, okay, but what did they want the FBI to do? Right? I was like, what, because your colleague over here is making these gestures at the FBI. What did they want the FBI to do exactly? And the colleague explained to me that the FBI investigation into this guy was tainted as part of its progress, in terms of its process, apologize. It was tainted in its process because I didn't quite understand, but the FBI agent who was principally involved in this for the FBI was somehow conflicted. I don't remember exactly what the nature of the conflict was. I think it was the Pulse nightclub's father or the Pulse nightclub's uncle or someone like that was an FBI informant and in unrelated issues. And so the FBI person who was investigating the Pulse nightclub before he became the Pulse nightclub shooter, right? This is before he became Pulse nightclub shooter. I think that's important to mention. So the FBI agent who's investigating this guy perhaps went lighter on him than he should have because he was perhaps concerned about protecting his asset, right? He didn't look into this guy enough because he didn't want to burn an asset. So maybe he corrupted his investigation somewhere. And I'm like, I'm like saying to the instructor, okay, but what should have happened? And well, he says, well, yeah, we should have gotten a non-conflicted guy. I'm like, no, you're not understanding my question. Let's say all that happened. Let's say a non-conflicted guy. What should have happened, right? Let's say a non-conflicted guy looks at this. What's next, right? And I was like, well, what's next is, they could have put a flag on his name, so if he buys weapons, it won't ban him from buying weapons, but everyone will know he's buying weapons. Which I'm not necessarily sure what you're supposed to do with that information necessarily. So like, okay, if the FBI had done their job, they would have put a flag on it. So when they did the background check for the purchase of weapons, that he would have gotten flagged and they would have known he's buying weapons, and then question mark, what's supposed to happen next? Because the FBI can't just go out and arrest people before they break the law, right? So, like, what's the FBI supposed to do here? What's the ATF supposed to do? What is the Florida Department of whatever supposed to do? What are you guys getting blamed for? What was supposed to happen that didn't happen? And it didn't feel like there was any answer to that question. It just feels like they're getting blamed because it's the Pulse nightclub shooter, and surely you should have done something so this didn't happen. Like what? What do you want us to do? What exactly is it you're asking us here? It didn't really feel satisfied. Didn't feel very satisfied by it. And the other question I asked, which I'm not sure my question was necessarily understood, or if it was, I wasn't really getting the answer. Maybe there was maybe there's no really good answer to it, or maybe they didn't know the answer to the question, but I didn't feel like I was really getting the exchange out of it I was hoping for. Because one of the colleagues, this female colleague who's a police officer, said something along the lines of that a lot of CEOs and other high performing people have psychopathy psychopath, psychopathic traits. Psychopathy. That was what I was looking for. Psychopathy or psychothopic traits, right? So there are a lot of CEOs, doctors, lawyers, other successful people who have traits that can be thought of as dark triad traits, right? So there are. And she was saying like how there are lawyers, judges, doctors, CEOs who are, unempathetic, psychopathic to some degree, maybe not, horribly so, but, they have these traits. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. And so I had a question for them. I was like, okay, is it possible for us to take someone like the Pulse nightclub shooter? Because now I'm going to provide an answer of like, what should we do, right? Or at least I'm going to provide a suggestion. What might we be able to do? I was like, is it possible that we can determine the Pulse nightclub shooter has those traits and be able to push him in a direction? Because we presumably 3 different options, right? Assuming we can detect it, right? Which is a whole other set of problems. But we have a person who's exhibiting these traits: psychotic, narcissistic, Machiavellian, these kind of traits, right? Dark triad traits. I said, okay, is it possible that if we can detect that, we presumably have 3 options, it seems to me. We can either try to change them in some way, through drugs or through culture or through education or through psychiatry or something. We can presumably try to change them. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is we can try to cabin them in some way. So we're going to try to restrict them in some way in society so that they are cabined, restrained, compartmentalized, so that they're in some sense unable to execute their traits, right? So we can change them. We can try to prevent them from acting. And then I'm like, okay, well, how about option number 3? Can we harness it? Maybe let's steer into the skid. How about that as an option? Maybe we steer into the skid. So I was like, is it possible that we could have taken the Pulse nightclub shooter and said, you know what? You are a Machiavellian, psychotic, narcissist. But rather than try to change you, rather than try to compartmentalize you or restrict you in some way, maybe we can harness you. Maybe there is some role that we can put you in that society can gain some benefit of. And my counterpart in this exchange suggested maybe special forces, which, hey, worst ideas. You need someone who can go in completely emotionally, completely cold, who really doesn't care about their own safety very much, and just willing to go in and commit a complete bloodbath and just be like, yeah, that's just another day at the office, right? So maybe special forces or something. Which it was not intended as insulting on his part, because I'm sure not all special forces people are like that. But I thought it was a reasonable suggestion. But I felt like I didn't get quite as much out of the exchange as I was hoping for in terms of, can we use this for good? Is there a way for us to extract value out of this as a society? So, that's kind of what I was wondering. Yeah. And Joe's Med says you may have war crimes. Yeah. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, Joe's. And maybe that's not the right answer. Maybe there is no right answer. You're sensing some flaws. Okay, we can nitpick this apart, but let's not nitpick apart the example too much. Let's, see if we can figure out if there's something we can do that's productive. And maybe if we give him enough outlet, he'll stay within the bounds of the Geneva Work Convention, which isn't, super duper hard. And also it's special forces. So there's that. So I don't know. It was very, very interesting. Psychopathic, yeah, psychopathic. We're working on the language here. We're having language problems. So it was very interesting watching the audience and watching the audience's language, body language, their emotional reaction. It was compassion on compassion on compassion. I felt like I was swimming in estrogen and compassion. And not a lot of analytical thinking in terms of, even Dr. Phil's talk was disappointing. It's one of those talks that feels well prepped and phoned in at the exact same time, which is annoying because Dr. Phil had slides and video clips, so obviously it was prepped. But his overall talk was, the title of it was Psychology of Evil. And his talk was rambling, incoherent, unorganized. It didn't have a really good narrative arc to it. He basically went with Justice Potter Stewart of I know it when I see it, which is distinctly unhelpful for whatever we're trying to figure out. Also, I didn't really like one line he said in particular, where he said that the reason that people in the audience can't understand this evil is because they don't have the evil inside them. And so they can't understand it, which I think is probably not true. I think the evil is probably inside of all of us, and we just try to ignore it most of the time. And most of the time we bury it. But I always like Carl Jung's idea of the shadow and the integration of the shadow, which is very troubling. I liked what Jordan Peterson says on this a lot better, that we all are ultimately capable of evil. The average Nazi soldier or the average German or even the average SS officer probably was just a normal person like everyone else, which is a reasonable assumption, right? They're probably just normal people. So or the average guard at the concentration camp in Poland or something. Probably it's you. Probably it's me. That's what Jordan Peterson says. I think he's probably right. It probably is you. It probably is me. It's a little bit too comforting to say, oh, it's not you. Oh, it's not me. It's too comforting. It's like, no, I could never be that. It's like, yeah, not only could you, you would. You would be that because they were that and they're you. I'm like, yeah, that's probably more true than, yeah. So I took a bit of exception to his line of, one of the reasons you don't understand this evil is because you can't do it. I'm like, I believe in you. I'm ready to stand up. I'm ready to stand up and before the audience is like, Dr. Phil may not believe in you, but I believe in you. I believe you have it in you. I believe you have it in you to be the most evil bastard of us all. I believe in you. You can do it, That's about where I'm ready to sit on that one. So, yeah. So, maybe confronting that rather than trying to avoid it may be the better course of action. Yeah. So, interesting time. And his speech felt a little haphazard and unorganized. It was a well-prepped phoned-in speech, which was annoying. All right, so now that I've talked about my overall thoughts on this, I want to go through the schedule of the things I attended and talk about some of the specific stuff I heard, and then talk a little bit about what I want to do with it afterwards. Yeah. All right, so here's the talks that I kind of went to and what I kind of understood. So starting with Friday, June 4th, there was a discussion about finding Rebecca Gould's killer. There was murder inside the boyfriend's home, and talking about how essentially the police went down the wrong track, fell into confirmation bias, and avoided some pretty strong indicators of who would ultimately be arrested, who's not. Yeah. Joe's Med says, read Ordinary Men. I've never read it, but I've heard tell. So, yeah. Stanford prison experiment. And Dr. Phil himself even noted the Milgram experiment and how many people complied in the Milgram experiment, which was the electric shocks. It was like 85% or something, 90% of people complied in the Milgram experiment. So it's like, yeah, when he says you don't have it in you, yeah, you do. You totally do. I believe in you. I believe in you. So anyways, talking about how the police essentially became tunnel visioned on the wrong person, ignored an obvious suspect, and how it took a long-term time to undo that. Then there was this interesting talk from this guy, Spencer Corson. I kind of like this guy. Interesting guy, interesting psychology. Airborne Ranger, fought in Afghanistan. He now runs a private bodyguard company, private security company. And he talks about essentially how safety essentially the idea is that when we feel safe, we put our guard down. And when we put our guard down, bad things can happen. So it's basically the overall thrust of his talk was one of maintaining like minimum levels of situational awareness, which I appreciate, right? So it's like, if we feel safe, we will put our guard down, and these really bad things can happen. So maybe we shouldn't so much. And I asked a question at the Q&A and got essentially booed by the audience, although not really. But, I think my question was malformed, or one of two things was true. My question was malformed. My question was badly formed, or my question was showing sympathy towards someone the audience didn't want to show sympathy with, and so the audience turned against me. And probably some combination thereof. So one of the things he talked about in his talk was this relatively young person. I want to say 8, 10, something like that. I'm not sure it really matters for the purposes of this exercise, but some school-age person, right? And this school-age person fought off a much older adult attacker, like a 35-year-old, whatever, successfully fought off this attacker, and the bad guy was caught, yada, yada, yada. And he said, as part of this talk, about how 2 weeks before all this happened, this same person who would ultimately commit this crime was seen circling this, because this happened at a bus stop. And this is a very strange bus stop because it's kind of like in a cul-de-sac, like in an island of a cul-de-sac surrounded by trees. It's a very strange looking bus stop. But where it happened in this kind of isolated place where this young student noticed this person in a van like 2 weeks earlier, like driving around or something. The student told the teacher told the principal didn't do anything about it. And of course, the entire audience goes, right? And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, okay, but what is anyone supposed to do here, right? Because what are we supposed to do? This guy's driving around in a van, and at least from the description that I was being told anything that seemed criminal. So I guess the police could just go up and talk to him if he wants to talk and see. They could do that, but not much more, right? Because he's not, at least at that point, doesn't seem to be breaking a crime. Or maybe he has a criminal record, and it was unclear, like, what someone wanted to do about it, right? It's just like the police, the principal did a bad by not reporting it. And everyone goes, ah. So I get up and I ask a question, which is essentially showing sympathy to the principal, which apparently is a very wrong thing to do. And I get up and I say something along the lines of, I could see myself making that decision in the principal's place. How can I avoid making that decision? And basically it's like, you could make that decision. It's like, yeah, I could see myself making the decision. And that's where the audience like basically turns against me, and you can feel the collective judgment of the audience, against you. You just can feel it. It's like, oh no, the audience has turned against me here. And he's like, well, why wouldn't you? What's the downside? It's like, well, maybe it's an issue of time, or because I'm trying to defend my answer, right? So I'm trying to defend my answer. It's like, well, why wouldn't you? Well, it's like, maybe, it's just not, you didn't, it's an issue of time, and it's an issue of resources. It's an issue, and like, and so I just say, well, I'm just trying to avoid how to make that mistake. And he just says, okay, report everything. I'm like, okay, great, and sit down, right? Because I've lost the audience completely in trying to sympathize with this principal, because I'm going under the working premise the principal is not a bad guy. And, if it were me, if it were you, maybe I would have made the same decision, right? And how can I avoid that? But apparently that was the wrong thing to say, because saying, hey, I could be the principal, I could be that guy, how could I not be that guy? Apparently that was the wrong thing to say to the audience, so it didn't go well for me. Yeah. What else did I see? Oh, yes. Then I went to this Justice Through Genomics talk. This was given by a guy called David Middleman, who apparently is running this company called Othram, which has been involved in DNA profiling and sequencing of some variety, which wasn't very well explained, that is allowing them to capture criminals that is in excess of current genomic technology. So wasn't quite sure exactly how they're doing that. Wasn't quite sure exactly how their system was better than what the FBI is doing right now, or more thorough, or more expansive. But he talked for a while, and I would have really liked more technical details. Vincius Prime says, it'll never happen to me. True that, man. True that. That's basically, yeah, it'll never happen to me. Of course I would have saw it. Of course I would have reported it. You sure? He didn't. He didn't. And if he'd report to the police officer, what, the police officer going to blow it off? Maybe the police officer has other things to do. It's like, we all know how it turned out in reality. Are you sure? That never happened to me. Uh-huh. Okay. So I was the bad guy because I said, I could be the principal. The principal is me and I am the principal was the wrong way to go with that audience. That was the wrong way to go. There was the same guy, Spencer Corson, gave a talk, Practical Tactical, what to do when your instincts fail you. Now, I was a little bit upset by this because it turned in a little bit more of a Q&A and would rather him give him more instructions. But he did point out that if you, just merely having a tool doesn't mean the tool will succeed if you're unfamiliar with it. So merely carrying a firearm, and he says, he's really pro Second Amendment, and I appreciate that. Unless you're putting 1,000 rounds down a month, which might be a little bit excessive, but his point is overall valid, then the tool will wind up being used against you. And merely having the tool might make you, so it's better, he says, to have a security mindset than the tool, because the tool might make you act in ways that might make you less secure, because you're leaning on the tool in a way that's inappropriate. This I understand. This I understand as a point. So it's like, it's not as important that you have the gun or the knife. It's more important that you have the psychology to be it's basically be situationally aware and be willing. And if you're going to fight, right? Don't do this half-ass thing. Just if you're going to fight like your life actually depends on it. He says things like, if you're in a car and you're being in the car against your will, you can break the glass. He says, now I'd recommend trying to do this at the corner of the glass rather than in the middle of the glass, because the corner of the glass is where it's weak. But you could elbow out the corner of the window of a car, or you could kick out the corner of a window of a car, or you could crash the car. You could crash the car, which, if you're being kidnapped and your life depends on it, crash the car is a viable option. And he's like, are you going to fight for this like your life depends on it or not? How about taking the steering wheel and jerking it? How about taking the gear shift lever, shoving it into park or neutral? How about just opening the door in the middle of the freeway and tumbling out? I respect these options. I respect this because, his overall point is like, if your life's on the line, how about actually going for it and actually fighting for it? So I was like, that sounds very, very fair. Yeah. So I like that. Let's see, what else did I go to? I missed the talk on the toolbox killers. I'm kind of upset about that. That's unfortunate. Yeah, a month is a little excessive. His point overall was sound. His point overall was you have to have familiarity with the tool. So I understood the point. Then I went to this wonderful cocktail hour, which was very nice, and a VIP dinner, which was also very nice, with this forensic artist, which I don't know what the point of that was. Let's see. Then I went to the talk with Brendan Dassey's lawyer, Lauren Nyrider. We've covered this case. This is the Making the Murderer case. We covered the Court of Appeals decision from the federal court about that one. Listen to his attorney. Now, his attorney it was all empathy. And so I didn't learn as much from it as I might have hoped. It was not a legal education seminar or even a discussion of comparative legal principles. Or it was just, my client is suffering and we're going to continue to fight. I'm like, I'm not sure with what, but good luck. Let me know if you find something. Unless you can get clemency from the governor or something, Oh, then I went to this thing about building a background that was a VIP talk about how to do background assessment, and they did, that was the guy that we spoke to earlier. So his name is Pierre Pacheco, Pacheco, Pierre Pacheco. He's a background investigator and investigator for law enforcement at Indian River State College. And then her name was Kimberly, but Lie, Masinek, who's a criminologist. So they teach at this college, and I think they also are law enforcement agencies and whatever. So we went through how background checks are reviewed and how they're analyzed and stuff like that, which was kind of interesting. One of the backgrounds was of the Pulse nightclub shooter, where you could see some obvious things in his background that made him look very questionable. Let's see. Psychology of Evil with Dr. Phil McGraw. We talked about that. I was very disappointed in terms of it. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Okay, that was this guy, Mark McClish. Retired supervisor, deputy U.S. Marshal. 9 years talking at the Marshal Service Academy. He's developed this thing called the statement analysis in order to determine if someone is lying or not, and written a book on this. So his theory is that you can determine if someone's lying because they'll use certain word choices and certain qualifiers someone who isn't lying would do. So, for example, he'll say the word "just" is a clue because it minimizes. So it's the difference between someone saying "I went to the store" versus "I just went to the store." He says if someone says "just," they are minimizing or indicating minimization, and it's a signal that you should investigate. Statements that are like I swear to God, or God is my witness, or any sort of thing like that. Oh, these convincing statements. Phil McGraw has something very similar. That's a clue. He said statements that show a sequence of events but indicate that there might be missing time in the sequence. So, for example, you'll see statements like, we did this, and after a while, or later, or something like that. So you'll see this like qualifier word that indicates, or something like following that. So you'll see this word, this phrase that can be understood as like maybe there's a gap of time here that's not being represented. So that was a clue, maybe. And what else did he say? He said, that 3 is a liar's number. He says if you have to make up a number with 3 or some sort of multiplier of 3 or involve the word 3. So if you don't know the answer you'll make up will be 3. And I've noticed that too, because I've done it in my own podcast on here. Like when I've said something and I've said, like 3 kajillion. When I'm making up a number, it's 3. So he says if you see these things of 3, there were 3 suspects that attacked me. Or he said there was this email, this phishing campaign that said, we've detected 30 irregularities. Or, so if you see that, or it happened at 3 a.m, not necessarily, none of these are like obviously stone cold indicators, but he says, you see a series of these things, these little tells, and you can determine that someone might be withholding. He says most people don't out and out lie. They'll just omit, or they'll evade, not answering the question asked, or giving like a qualifier. So, or answering a question with a question. So it says, did you go to the park? Oh, did I go to the park? Well, because it's used as a mechanism to buy time to repeat the question. So if they have to repeat the question, or they ask the question with a question, they might be deflecting. So I don't know the degree to which any of those are solid indicators or not, but it was an interesting talk. He's apparently written 2 books about it that might be interesting. So if you're interested in that topic, you might be interested in reading his books about detecting lying and stuff like that. He says, it's been very valuable to him in his career. I asked him if there was any sort of quantification of that, though. Has he done any sort of analysis to determine that these phrases are actually more indicative of lying? And he said, like, I'm not sure how you would necessarily do that. And I said, well, I can think of at least one way. I said, if you could get a set of all statements, all statements people are making, and you can determine which ones are true and which ones are not, because you've done investigation after the fact. So you're able to determine when someone was telling the truth and when someone was lying, right? Then it might be possible to do some sort of linguistic frequency analysis. Here's all the words that appear in all the statements. If a word appears more frequently, or phrases appear more frequently, right? Then you might be able to do a quantification and say, this word appears 10% more often. This phrase appears 30% more often. And if it appears 50% more often, it's 70% more of an indication of a lie. So you might be able to do some sort of linguistic frequency analysis in order to quantify this to some degree, but apparently he has not done that. So for those of you who are out there looking for like a master's or PhD thesis, there's a suggestion for you. Yeah. And then I did that ride along thing, which is kind of bullshit, which I talked about because we put up the picture. Aww. Then we went to the red flags about the Pulse nightclub shooting, where they basically got up and kind of tried to defend themselves for an hour about why we didn't fuck this up and why we're not responsible for the Pulse nightclub shooter. Which, yeah, I mean, sure. Okay. I mean, you didn't tell me anything that would have made me think you're responsible, or anyone else is really responsible for that matter, or anyone else fucked up. So, yeah, there were red flags and Penny. People caught the red flags. Not sure what, if anything, could have been done about it. Maybe there's something more productive we could have done with him. That's the only thing I can think. Because, I don't know that you can really change somebody, especially if they're not willing to change. That can be hard. Cabining somebody is very difficult, especially if you want to do it in any kind of legal sense, right? Because, you can deny them anything they don't have a right to. So no one particularly has the right to join the police, for example. So you could cabin them that way, but, you can't cabin legal rights. So you may not be able to change them. You may not be able to cabin them, but maybe you can exploit them. Can we exploit the Pulse nightclub shooter? That's the question that ranges in my mind. So, question unanswered, though, unfortunately, as far as I was concerned. Also, it was interesting because I was thinking about this after the fact. Because this guy, Pierre Pacheco, very interesting guy. I like this guy very much. His thought process very much echoes mine. Sort of very thoughtful, analytical, by the numbers. And he also says how, he puts on masks and he doesn't let people know what he's thinking, and he's really good at it. So, for example, apparently the Pulse nightclub shooter, when he came in for his interview about becoming a police officer, apparently the Pulse nightclub shooter before he handed him his packet for the background stuff, he handed him a manifesto. Handed him a manifesto with names of people who have harmed him. And apparently our guy here just says, oh, okay, that's cool, and just puts it aside while he's silently freaking out to himself. But of course he doesn't leave that on because he wants to be able to use that later, which I respect, right? So, he's able to do that, which good for him. So I was thinking about this later, whether or not he was evaluating me, which I'm sure he is, just by training, if not explicitly, right? So he was telling about an incident about one of the things about the Pulse nightclub shooter and how he would toe this line between making threats that are actionable and not, right? So he said, one time in the class, the Pulse nightclub shooter said, how many bolts are in an extended magazine? 28. And then he starts counting off people. 1, 2, 3, 4. He's telling the story and people are going, oh. So later at the Q&A, because I just couldn't help myself, I was like, as I was talking to him, I was like, oh, by the way, it's 33 in an extended mag, not 28. Because fascination with guns is apparently an indicator. So I corrected him, and he's just like, oh, okay. And I was wondering whether or not he was evaluating me at that point, which probably, that's okay. So, fine. And then there was a discussion about the Colonial Parkway murders. This is 4 double homicides. So that's 8 total homicides for those of you counting at home. 4 double homicides in Virginia. And there is, that are near each other geographically. And obviously there's a suggestion about whether or not it's a killer or how many killers are involved, right? Is it 1 or 2, 3, 4? How many distinct murderers are there, or groups of murderers are there? Is it all one common person? Is it 4 distinct persons? Is it somewhere in between? We don't know. So there was a discussion relating to that, which is a little bit high level for me to do anything with, and that was the end of the talk. Doesn't the number depend on gun and caliber? Yes. But he said 28, and the only thing I could think of that would hold that many is a Glock. Right? It's a Glock extended magazine. So he never said it explicitly. Also, the fact that it's for police, right? Because this is a adjunct to becoming a police officer. So, I did reach a couple, I made a couple assumptions in my head, right? He says 28, so I'm like, okay, what extended magazine for a pistol holds that many? It's a Glock. It's a Glock extended magazine. It's a Glock because those are common for police officers. So yeah, I made an assumption about what the extended magazine was. I'm like, okay, it's 33, not 28. But yes, it would depend. But for the purposes of our exercise, I felt like I'd make a pretty safe bet. Right? So yeah. Yeah. So that's how all that worked out. Yeah, so 4 double homicides over different time periods, which may or may not be related. So, also, it was interesting because there was at least one person there who was just handing out cards relating to her son. She was dressed in military uniform. He apparently was military as well. Negligent homicide. And she was handing out cards to look into his case. So, there was at least one person there who's trying to get justice for their kid or trying to look into it or trying to bring attention to it. So, all that stuff too, which is kind of heartbreaking. So, yeah. I came to the conclusion, I came to a couple conclusions. I came to the conclusion that this event was emotion forward. It was emotion forward. And even more to the point, it was compassion forward. This was just compassion. It was very motherly, protective of the young, very sort of, it was very it was female. It was female. The energy is female. The reactions are female. The discussion's female. It's emotion driven. It's story driven. Right? It's story driven. And it's compassion driven. And it's like feeding that emotion. And actually it got a little bit tiring to me. Because compassion is not, again, a primary emotion of mine. And I became well saturated very fast. And so I became very fatigued. These people can't get enough apparently, but I became fatigued because, it's just constantly feeding that emotion. And that's not, and it was interesting with the duo from the college, with the Pierre guy and his counterpart, because they're very different too. Like, he's a lot like me, and she is the exact opposite. She is even more the crowd than the crowd is the crowd. This girl, or this woman, I apologize for calling a girl. That was disrespectful. What's her name? Hold on. No, not that guy. Who else? There. Kimberly Masnick. Started a professional career as a criminologist on serial crime. After years of lectures, she felt that what was lacking is the victim. She's made sure that she speaks about victims. Founded the Institute for Cold Case Investigations, which allows her students to work with law enforcement. Became a true crime podcaster, and day job is a professor with Criminal Justice Department in Indian River State College in Southern Florida. And she is emotional. I don't say that to say that she's like uncontrolled. She's just emotionally driven. Her psyche is emotional. And she is a lot for me. So, and apparently a lot for Pierre, who kind of looks at the whole thing with what I would term as like a sort of quiet bemusement at the whole thing. It was really, really interesting. I like this Pierre Peccio guy. He could definitely extract confessions from me. Not that I'm sure he'd have any hard time anyway, but he thinks a lot like me. So he was an interesting guy. So good times. Yeah. So it was a super interesting tour, and then of course I met some of the podcasters. I met like I think all the podcasters pretty much. I made a point to try to meet them all. Let me see if I can find a list of the ones that were there. No, that's not what I want at all. But there were a lot of ones. There's like True Crime Garage was there, and they were very very popular. They had huge lines waiting for them a lot of days. Just trying to see if I could get a list of the podcasts that were there. No, not really. But yeah, the one that was the most interesting to me was one called the prosecutors because, as the name implies, they're prosecutors, and so I thought maybe it might provide some sort of ability for me in terms of trying to find stuff for my content. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. So all good. Did I meet some beautiful single women? Uh, the most beautiful woman there was a podcaster, and she wasn't giving me the time of day, but that's okay. So that's basically what I thought. It was an interesting convention. It wasn't for me. It wasn't made for me. And that's okay. Not everything has to be made for me. But I noticed it. Right. And I noticed the reaction of the audience. I noticed how they were responding to information. And I noticed my own process distinct from that. And it was interesting just observing it. It was interesting observing it from this kind of foreign observer perspective. And I wondered how many people else in the audience might have been feeling that way. There were other people that were there, right? I don't know how many other single guys were there. There were a lot of guys. There were guys there with their significant others. To the extent there were guys, they were there as couples. I'm not sure how many single guys were there. It may not have been many, because it wasn't really developed. Who weren't there for some sort of professional reason or something. But it was interesting because it's like, yeah, whatever this is it was not built for me, and I also didn't gain a lot out of it in terms of stuff for my content. So I don't really know where I want to go with this in terms of trying to develop it, if at all, for my own channel. So I don't know what we'll do, if anything, related to that. I did have one idea um, about doing some true crime stuff that would be older stuff, older cases, but I don't know if that would be appealing or not. I think the true crime people love the stuff that's happening right now, like the Daybell case and stuff like that, and just getting into that bullshit. But that's really tiring covering that like full time. That's very tiring, especially with a full time job. It's hard to keep up on, full time, especially trying to get up and trying to feed this need that it's like, yeah, no, I don't know. But in any case, it was a business expense, so look forward to writing that off on my taxes either way, because it was a business development expense. Yeah. I would have loved to get more time with Dasso's lawyer or more time with the prosecutor's lawyers and geek out. The prosecutor podcast people were hard to find. They were they were hard to pin down. They were not at the table very often. So I did invite them for drinks one time, and they said yes, and then I couldn't pin them down again. So maybe another time. But that's all the good things. So yeah, we'll see what's going on. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything for me for my channel to develop against. But it was an interesting thing being there, foreign man in a foreign land with a lot of women. And like, this is interesting. It was an interesting experience. On the plus side, no, I had a fairly good time, all things considered, and the amount I paid for the VIP package was nice. I got a decent dinner out of it, and it was open bar, so hey, worked out all right. Yeah, it worked out okay. So that's all I have to really say about that. Tonight we'll be on later to dissect this Second Amendment decision from the trial court in California, our new, which will be our new based judge hero. Yeah, based judge in addition to based judge Stickman. All right, so we have a new based judge to geek out over in this 90-page or whatever it is decision, just completely destroying the AR-15 ban in California, like 8,000 different ways. It's satisfying on a very intellectual level because it's thoughtful and well-reasoned. So we'll read that and we'll enjoy the shit out of that and talk about that and maybe where that's going to go, if anywhere in the future, but that'll be fun. So, yeah. So we'll do that sometime later because that's going to take a couple hours to really just go through and enjoy that little, so much fun stuff, right? Yeah. So we'll do that later. Agatha says, if you think a lot of coverage comes from emotion, maybe people enjoy a different perspective. No, I don't know, man. I think the audience knows what they want. And so, if I want that audience, telling the audience what they want is usually a bad plan. Telling the audience what they want is usually a bad plan. But, if I want to feed that audience, I have to figure out how to do that, man. So, all good times. All right, so I'm going to sign. Well, my hair's a little spoofy. So, yeah, I'm going to sign off for now. I hope you enjoyed this stream. If any of you happen to be there at CrimeCon, I did run into one person who recognized me. They recognized me peripherally from Emily's show. They were a big fan of Emily D. Baker's, and they remembered me from the one appearance I made on her show where I was together with Nate. So they at least, I don't think they recognized me right away, but I think in conversation I mentioned, oh, yeah, I do a legal podcast. And she's like, oh, I thought I recognized you, Emily D. Baker. And it's like, yeah. So, yeah, I ran into one person who recognized me, but this is definitely not my audience, which is okay. It doesn't have to be. But, yeah. If Emily D. Baker winds up giving a talk on one of these things, it wouldn't surprise me, though. Or maybe this is more an audience for her. She might be able to work this audience. I don't know about me. I don't know if I can work this audience or not. We'll find out. I'm not going to sign up for now. You watch me only for my hair? Okay, well, thanks, Emily. If you liked this content, please remember to give it a like. If you attend a true crime convention, please remember to give me a comment. Say what you did or did not like about it. What your observations were. Leave a comment in the description, all that good stuff. Be interested to hear what you had to say. Remember to hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when we go on live tonight with our discussion about this Ninth Circuit decision, which destroys everything California ever thought it knew about gun rights bans. Excellent. That'll be fun. Until later, my friends, hope all is well. Cheers and goodbye.